The Great Wall of China. Built to do what exactly? We all know the image, a single monolithic structure of stone and brick snaking over misty mountains, a wonder of the world, so vast it is claimed you can see it from space. We think of it as the Great Wall. One wall, built for one purpose, to keep them out, to create a definitive line between the civilized Middle Kingdom and the barbarian hordes of the steppe. But what if that image is an illusion? What if the Great Wall isn't a wall at all, but 1,000 different walls, built, rebuilt, and abandoned over 2,000 years by dozens of different dynasties? What if it was built not just of stone, but of rammed earth, mud, and willow branches? And what if its purpose wasn't just defense? What if it was also a highway, a customs office, a trade filter, a jobs program, and ultimately, a magnificent, tragic failure? Welcome to Cultural Echoes. Today we are not looking at the wall we think we know. We are asking the question, the Great Wall of China, built to do what exactly? Before the wall, the era of warring states. To find the origin of the Great Wall, we must first travel back to a time before China was China. We must go to the 5th century BCE, to an era of chaos, brilliance, and bloodshed, known as the Warring States period. The old Zhou dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was a hollow shell. Its power had evaporated, and the kingdom had fractured into 7 major competing states: Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yuan, and Zhou. These states were locked in a constant, near-perpetual struggle for survival and supremacy. This was the age of 100 schools of thought, a time of profound philosophy. Confucius, Laozi, and Sun Tzu all emerged from this chaos. But it was also an age of total war. In this environment, a new technology of defense became critical, and the first great walls were built. But these walls were not pointed north, towards the steppe. They were pointed inward. They were built by the states, against each other. The state of Wei, located in the vulnerable Central Plains, built a massive wall in 358 BCE to defend itself from its aggressive western neighbor, the state of Qin. The state of Qi built a wall to defend against Chu. These were not the stone fortresses we picture today. They were marvels of early engineering, built primarily of hangtu, or rammed earth. This was a painstaking, brutal, and effective technology. Workers would build a wooden frame, a few meters long and perhaps half a meter wide, and fill it with thin layers of local earth. They would then pound this earth flat, over and over, with heavy wooden tampers, until it was as hard as cement. They would then move the frame up and repeat the process. The result was a massive, hard-packed earthen rampart, incredibly resistant to the weapons of the day: swords, spears, and early catapults. These walls were formidable. The Wall of Wei stretched for hundreds of kilometers, but they were, fundamentally, borders of paranoia. They were the physical manifestation of the political chaos, an attempt to carve a permanent line in a world that was fluid and violent. They were built to define a territory, to channel armies to specific choke points, and to slow down the relentless tide of invasion from a rival Chinese state. But at the same time, a different kind of threat was emerging, and it was coming from a different direction. To the north of the states of Yuan, Zhao, and Qin lay the vast, endless expanse of the Eurasian steppe. This was the domain of a new and terrifying kind of society. The nomadic horse-archer peoples like the Xiongnu were a new force in the world. They had no cities, no farms, no walls of their own. Their state was their herd, and their army was their entire male population. A Xiongnu warrior was, in essence, the world's first true light cavalry. He was born on horseback, learned to shoot a bow from the saddle as a child, and could ride for days, living off dried meat and mare's milk. He had no supply lines to cut, and no capital city to conquer. He was a man-wolf, as the Chinese annals would later call him. Against this enemy, the traditional armies of the warring states were useless. Their armies were built around slow-moving infantry and heavy aristocratic war chariots. A Xiongnu raid would appear as if from the wind, slaughter a farming village, seize grain and people, and vanish back into the steppe long before the state army could even be mobilized. The northern states were the first to face this new asymmetric warfare, and they were the first to innovate. King Wuling of the state of Zhao, in 307 BCE, did something radical. He forced his court to adopt the barbarian fashion. He traded his flowing silk robes for the trousers, boots, and belt of the nomads. And he forced his army to abandon the war chariot and build its own force of light cavalry to fight the Xiongnu on their own terms. But even this was not enough. The raiders were too fast, and so the northern states, Zhao, Yuan, and later Qin, began to build a different kind of wall. They began to build long earthen ramparts facing north. These were not the first Great Wall. They were a series of separate, pragmatic, and often desperate defensive lines. They connected watchtowers, fortified mountains, and garrison towns. They were an admission of failure, an admission that even with a cavalry of their own, they could not control the steppe. The best they could do was to defend the farm. These northern walls were an attempt to solve an economic and military problem. They were an early warning system, a way to slow a raid down, and a physical barrier to protect the agricultural heartland from a mobile, predatory neighbor. So, by the 3rd century BCE, the land we now call China was scarred with walls. There were the massive internal walls built by Chinese states to fight each other, and there were the newer northern walls built by the border states to defend against the nomads. They were a patchwork of earthen defenses, a map of a world in total conflict. It was into this world that the man who would finally end the chaos was born. A man who would conquer all his rivals, unite the states, and declare himself the first emperor. His name was Qin Shi Huang. And as he stood on the preciping of his new, unified empire, he looked at this legacy of walls, and he had a new and much, much grander idea. The first Great Wall, the Qin Dynasty. The chaos of the warring states period ended with a speed and a brutality that shocked the ancient world. The state of Qin, a grim, militaristic kingdom on the western frontier, did not just defeat its rivals, it devoured them. By 221 BCE, its king, Ying had conquered all 6 other states, forging them into a single unified entity. He had unified all under heaven. This was not just a political victory, it was a conceptual revolution. To rule his new, vast, and fractionited empire, Ying shed his title as king, a title now tarnished by the squabbling of the warring states, and created a new one. He declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first sovereign emperor. He was not just another ruler, he was the beginning of a new age, a divine figure who had brought order to the cosmos. His philosophy of rule was not Confucianism, with its emphasis on morality and tradition. It was legalism, a cold, pragmatic, and ruthless doctrine that demanded absolute obedience to the law and absolute power for the emperor. To forge a single China from the wreckage of 7 warring cultures, he standardized everything: the currency, the weights and measures, the width of cart axles, so all roads would be uniform, and most famously, the written script. He also, in a terrifying act of cultural erasure, ordered the burning of the books and the burying of the scholars. an attempt to destroy the philosophical traditions of the past and ensure that all thought began with him. In this new, unified, and brutally standardized empire, the old walls were a problem. The internal walls, the ones built by Wei, Qi, and Han against each other, were an ugly scar, a physical reminder of the disunity he had erased. Qin Shi Huang ordered them to be systematically demolished. Their rammed earth ramparts were torn down, their moats filled in. They were a symbol of the past, and in the Qin Empire, the past was treason. But the northern walls, the ones built by Yuan, Zhao, and his own Qin state to face the steppe, were a different story. They were an opportunity to the north. The Xiongnu, the nomadic horsemen, had seen the chaos of the warring states as a blessing. But now, with a single, terrifyingly powerful emperor to their south, they too began to unify, forming a vast tribal confederation under a charismatic leader. They were no longer scattered raiders. They were a rival empire. Qin Shi Huang, the ultimate legalist, could not tolerate this ambiguity on his border. His new empire was one of precision. It needed clear, defined, and absolute lines. The northern frontier was messy, a fluid zone of farms and pasture land where his subjects and the nomads intermingled. This was unacceptable. In 215 BCE, he gave a monumental order to his most brilliant general, Meng Tian. Meng Tian was dispatched to the north with a massive army, perhaps 300,000 strong. His first task was offensive, to drive the Xiongnu from the rich pasture lands of the Ordos Loop, a fertile bend in the Yellow River, and to pacify the frontier. His second task was defensive, and it was the largest construction project in human history to that point. Qin Shi Huang did not order him to build the Great Wall. He ordered him to connect the walls. Meng Tian was to take the existing northern walls of Yan, Zhao, and Qin, hundreds of kilometers of rammed earth ramparts that already existed, and link them together. He was to fill in the gaps, strengthen the weak points, and extend the line, creating one single, continuous, unified barrier. This was a project of staggering ambition, and its purpose was threefold. First, it was a military barrier. It was not intended to stop a Xiongnu army. A determined force could always breach a rammed earth wall. Rather, it was a tripwire. It was a high-tech security system. The wall would be studded with watchtowers, garrison posts, and signal towers. A Xiongnu raid, which relied on speed and surprise, would be forced to slow down to find a gap or bring siege equipment. As soon as they were spotted, the signal towers would light their fires, sending a message of smoke by day and flame by night that would race down the line, alerting the central command. It was a system to channel the raiders, to rob them of their speed, and to buy time for the Qin army to mobilize. Second, it was a political statement. By demolishing the internal walls and building one external wall, Qin Shi Huang was making a physical, unmistakable claim. He was drawing a line on the earth and declaring to the world, "This is the limes, the boundary of civilization. Everything inside this line is China. Everything outside is barbarism." It was the border of his new, standardized empire, as clean and absolute as his new script. Third, and perhaps most cynically, it was a project of political and social control. It was a way to dispose of the emperor's enemies. The workforce that built Meng Tian's wall was not a volunteer corps. It was a conscript army of unimaginable size, composed of soldiers, peasants, and, most of all, criminals. In the Qin legalist state, a criminal could be anyone: a scholar who had quoted an old poem, a merchant who had haggled too much, or a farmer who had failed to meet his quota. These millions of dispossessed, the discontented and the conquered peoples, were sent to the frigid, desolate northern frontier to build the wall and pay for their crimes. The human cost was catastrophic, an echo that has survived in Chinese folklore for 2,000 years. The work was brutal, the climate unforgiving, the guards merciless. A saying from the time survives: "If the emperor's son is born, do not raise him. If a daughter is born, raise her, and feed her with the finest dried meat. For do you not see? The Great Wall is built on the bones of men." The legend of Meng Yanu, the Lady Meng, tells of a woman whose husband was conscripted to build the wall. When he never returned, she traveled to the frontier, only to find he had died, and his body was buried inside the wall's rammed earth core. She wept at the wall for 3 days and 3 nights, the legend says, until the wall itself collapsed, revealing her husband's bones. This is the origin of the wall's other name, the longest graveyard on earth. This first Great Wall was not a stone dragon on a mountaintop. It was a long, low, brown snake of rammed earth, winding through the plains and deserts of the north. And it was a colossal failure. It was a staggering drain on the imperial treasury. It required a massive, permanent army to garrison it, and it generated a sea of hatred among the very people it was built by. In 210 BCE, Qin Shi Huang died, searching for an elixir of immortality. Almost immediately, the empire he had built with such brutality began to crumble. The rebellion that toppled his dynasty was sparked, in part, by conscripts who, delayed by rain, were facing execution for being late to their wall-building duties. Within 4 years of his death, the Qin dynasty was gone, and the first Great Wall, the unified border of the first emperor, was left to the winds. It was a magnificent, tragic, and flawed idea, a monument to one man's will, and a testament to the suffering of millions, the Han Dynasty, a wall for the Silk Road. The Qin dynasty, built on brutal law and human bone, lasted a mere 15 years. It was a fiery, violent, and short-lived experiment. When it collapsed in 206 BCE, China descended once more into a bloody civil war. The grand, unified wall of Qin Shi Huang, the product of so much suffering, was almost immediately abandoned. Without the massive garrisons of Qin soldiers to man it, the long, rammed earth rampart began to do what all untended structures do. It began to decay. The winds of the north eroded its surface, and local farmers, no longer under the watchful eye of an imperial guard, began to poach its materials, pulling down sections of the wall to build their own homes and farmsteads. The Xiongnu, the nomadic enemy it was built to stop, simply rode around its decaying ends, or through its now unguarded gates. The first Great Wall had failed. From the ashes of this civil war, a new dynasty emerged, the Han. Its founder was a man of the people, a peasant who became a general named Liu Bang, known to history as Emperor Gaozu. The Han dynasty would rule for over 400 years and would forge the very identity of the Chinese people, who still bear its name today. Emperor Gaozu inherited a nation in ruins and a treasury that was empty. He also inherited the Xiongnu problem. In fact, the Xiongnu were now stronger than ever, united under a powerful leader named Modu Chanyu. In 200 BCE, just as Gaozu was consolidating his power, he decided to teach the Xiongnu a lesson, leading a massive army north. The lesson, however, was his. At the Battle of Baideng, Modu Chanyu, feigning weakness, lured Gaozu deep into the mountains and then snapped the trap shut. 400,000 Xiongnu cavalry surrounded the Han emperor and his army, trapped for 7 days in the bitter cold, without supplies. Gaozu was facing total annihilation. He only managed to escape through a desperate act of bribery and trickery. This was a foundational trauma for the new Han dynasty. It was a terrifying realization. Even with the full might of a unified China, they could not defeat the masters of the steppe in open combat. The Qin model of total defense had failed, and the Han model of total offense had also failed. They needed a new strategy. And so the Han implemented a policy that was the complete opposite of building a wall. It was a policy of appeasement, known as the Heqin, or peace and kinship. This was, in essence, a massive strategic bribe. The Han court agreed to send a royal princess, usually a daughter from a lesser line, but officially a daughter of the emperor, north to marry the Xiongnu Chanyu. Along with this royal bride, the Han sent a massive annual tribute of silk, wine, rice, and other luxury goods. This was a calculated act of humiliation. The civilized Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, was paying protection money to the barbarians it claimed to despise. For over 70 years, this was the Han grand strategy. It was not a wall, it was an open hand offering gifts. The goal was not to keep the Xiongnu out, but to buy them off. The hope was that the luxuries of China would soften them, make them dependent, and that the royal brides would give birth to half Han heirs, who would be more sympathetic to their uncle, the emperor. It didn't work. The Xiongnu took the gifts, and they kept raiding anyway. The border was in a constant state of low-level warfare, and the humiliation in the Han court festered. Then, in 141 BCE, a new emperor ascended the throne. He was a young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless man named Liu Che, known to history as Emperor Wu, the martial emperor. Emperor Wu inherited an empire that, after 70 years of peace, however humiliating, was now rich. Its treasuries were full, its granaries were overflowing. And he was not interested in appeasing the Xiongnu. He was interested in destroying them. Emperor Wu changed everything. He launched a series of massive, offensive campaigns, sending his cavalry generals, Wei Qing and Huo Qubing, deep into the steppe, thousands of kilometers from the border, to attack the Xiongnu on their own terms. This was a total war, designed to break their power forever. But Emperor Wu had another, even grander ambition. He was not just looking north, he was looking west. He wanted to find allies to fight the Xiongnu, and he wanted to control the legendary trade routes that led to Central Asia, to Persia, and beyond. He sent his envoy, Zhang Qian, on a perilous journey west, an act that would officially open the network we now call the Silk Road. And this is where the Great Wall is reborn, but for a completely new purpose. As Emperor Wu's armies pushed the Xiongnu back, they conquered a long, narrow, and vulnerable strip of land known as the Hexi Corridor. This corridor, a thin ribbon of oases pressed between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, was the only viable land route from China to the west. This corridor was the lifeline of the new Silk Road, and it had to be protected. Emperor Wu ordered the construction of a new wall. But this wall was not like the Qin wall. It was not a border wall, designed to separate China from the barbarism of the north. This was a corridor wall. It was an offensive, logistical, and commercial tool. It was a fortified highway. Its primary purpose was not to stop a massive invasion into China. Its purpose was to protect the thin, fragile line of trade and communication out of China. It was built to protect merchants, diplomats, and soldiers traveling west. It was a massive military pipeline, projecting Han power outward. The engineering was also revolutionary. In the deserts of the Hexi Corridor, there was no loess earth to ram. The Han engineers improvised. They created a new kind of wall. They built a framework of woven reeds and tamarisk branches and filled it with layers of gravel and sand, pounding each layer flat. This reed and gravel wall was incredibly durable, resistant to the harsh, dry winds of the Gobi. Sections of this 2,000-year-old Han wall still stand today, a testament to its genius. This new wall was studded with watchtowers and fortresses, but its most important features were its gates. The most famous of these was the Yuan, the Jade Gate. The Jade Gate was not a defensive choke point, it was a customs house. It was the official entry and exit point for the Silk Road. It was here that caravans were inspected, taxes were levied, and passports were checked. The wall, in this sense, was a tool of filtration. It wasn't meant to stop everyone. It was meant to channel everyone, to force all trade through a single taxable point. So for the Han Dynasty, the Great Wall had a new, multi-layered purpose. It was a communication system, using smoke and fire signals to pass messages along the Silk Road. It was a shield, protecting valuable caravans from bandits and rival tribes. And it was a customs filter, ensuring the state got its cut of the lucrative silk trade. It was a tool not of isolation, but of empire. It was not a wall looking inward in fear. It was a wall looking outward in ambition. The Void, an abandoned border, 220 to 581 CE. The Han Dynasty, which had ruled for 4 glorious centuries and which had redefined the wall as a tool of commerce and empire, could not last forever. By 220 CE, it collapsed, just as the Roman Empire would, under the weight of its own internal contradictions, peasant rebellions, and ambitious generals. China, that single unified entity, shattered. What followed was not an interlude. It was an epoch. It was a 360-year period of profound division, chaos, and transformation, known as the Period of Disunion, the Three Kingdoms, and the Northern and Southern Dynasties. And in this long, fractured era, the Great Wall, as a concept, died. This is the great void in the wall's history. For over 3 centuries, no Chinese dynasty engaged in any systematic, large-scale wall building on the northern frontier. The very idea of the wall was abandoned. To ask why is to understand the single most important plot twist in the wall's entire 2,000-year story. The answer is simple. The barbarians won. The very people the wall was designed to keep out had crossed the line, not just as raiders but as settlers, as warlords, and ultimately as emperors. The fall of the Han created a massive power vacuum in northern China. The crumbling, unmanned, and now irrelevant Qin and Han walls could not stop the inevitable nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples from the steppe. The Xianbei, the Tuoba, the Ruran poured south. But they did not just raid and leave. They stayed. They carved out their own kingdoms. They fought each other. And eventually, one of these barbarian clans, the Tuoba clan of the Qianbei people, conquered all of northern China and, in 386 CE, established the Northern Wei dynasty. This event changes everything. The rulers of northern China were now, themselves, of nomadic steppe warrior descent. They were the very people the wall had been built to defend against. And this creates the ultimate irony. Why would you build a wall to keep yourself out? The Northern Wei emperors found themselves in a curious position. They were a nomadic elite, ruling over a vast population of sedentary Han Chinese farmers. Their barbarian heritage was their military strength, but their new Chinese population was their economic strength. Their entire political project became one of balancing and then blending these two identities. The Emperor Yuan, in the late 5th century, made a radical decision. He decided to stop being a Xianbei and to become Chinese. He moved his capital from the steppe-adjacent city of Pingcheng further south into the heart of the Chinese motherland, to Luoyang. He banned the Yuanbei language, dress, and customs at court. He forced his own people to adopt Chinese surnames. He was aggressively, systematically, cynicizing his own dynasty. In this new world, what was the purpose of the Great Wall? It was an embarrassment. It was a relic of a failed us versus them mentality. The them was now us. The wall was no longer a border. It was just an old, crumbling fortification running inconveniently through the middle of their new, blended kingdom. And so, the wall was left to die. The rammed earth ramparts of the Qin dynasty, now 600 years old, eroded under the wind and rain, slumping back into the earth from which they had been raised. They became low, rounded mounds, indistinguishable in places from the natural hills. The Han Wall in the west, the great corridor to the Silk Road, suffered a different fate. The Jade Gate, the great customs house, was abandoned. The caravans no longer had a central imperial power to protect or to tax them. The trade routes became more fragmented, more dangerous, and in many places they shifted south. The Han Wall itself, that marvel of reed and gravel engineering, was left to the Gobi. The sands of the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts, in a slow, relentless tide, began to reclaim it. Watchtowers, once manned by lonely soldiers, were buried to their ramparts. Sections of the wall vanished completely beneath giant dunes. It became a ghost, a long graveyard, in a new sense. It was the grave of a dead idea, the idea of a single, linear border. This period of disunion was not a dark age, however. It was a time of profound philosophical change. Into this void, a new idea, which had traveled along the very Silk Road the Han Wall had protected, took root. Buddhism. This new philosophy, with its emphasis on transcendence, the illusion of the self, and the release from worldly suffering, offered a comfort that the rigid, state-centric philosophies of legalism and Confucianism could not. The Northern Wei emperors, in their quest for a new identity, became its greatest patrons. They carved the magnificent, colossal Buddhas into the cliffs at the Yungang and Longmen grottos. These were the new Great Walls. They were not structures of division. They were monumental expressions of a new, universal faith. The resources that might have once gone to maintaining 1,000 kilometers of useless wall were now being poured into carving mountains into the faces of gods. For nearly 400 years, the wall was a forgotten line. It was a quarry for local farmers, a bump in the landscape, a memory. The frontier was no longer a wall. It was a fluid, dynamic, and integrated zone where cultures were not separating but fusing. The great historical project of the wall had, for now, completely failed. It would take the reunification of China under a new, powerful, and fiercely ambitious dynasty, the Sui, to even consider the idea of a border wall again. The Cosmopolitan Empire. The Sui and Tang dynasties. After nearly 4 centuries of division, a general from the north named Yang Jian, a man of mixed Xianbei and Han heritage, did what Qin Shi Huang had done before him. He conquered his rivals, unified China, and in 581 CE declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Sui. Like the Qin, the Sui dynasty was a brief, brutal, and world-changing flashpoint. It was an age of monumental, almost megalomaniacal construction. The Sui emperors re-established a central government, rebuilt the economy, and, most famously, built the Grand Canal, a waterway system that would link the fertile Yangtze River Valley in the south with the political heartland in the north. And like the Qin, the Sui emperors looked at their newly unified northern border, and they felt the old anxiety. The Jiangnu were long gone, scattered and absorbed. The Xianbei were now the rulers of China. But the steppe, that great mother of warriors, had produced a new threat. This was the Gokturk Khaganate, a vast nomadic empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Black Sea. They were the new masters of the north, and they began to raid the newly wealthy Sui frontiers. Emperor Wen of Sui, a pragmatist, initially tried the Han Dynasty's Heikin policy, sending a princess and lavish gifts. But his son, the ambitious Emperor Yang, had grander plans. He was a man in the mold of Qin Shi Huang, and he believed in massive, decisive projects. He did, in fact, order a return to wall building. During his reign, he conscripted millions of laborers, men and women, and sent them to the northern frontier to build new walls and repair old ones. The ancient chronicles are brief but chillingly familiar. They speak of over 1 million men conscripted for one section alone, of the work being so brutal that half the men died. Once again, the wall was a project of conscripted labor. Once again, it was a tool to address the barbarian problem. And once again, this very brutality was a catalyst for the dynasty's end. The Sui dynasty, like the Qin, exhausted its people with its massive projects, the canal, disastrous wars in Korea, and the wall. It lasted only 37 years before it was consumed by rebellion. In 618 CE, one of these rebels, a general named Yuan, seized the capital and declared the founding of a new dynasty. It would become, perhaps, the single greatest golden age in Chinese history. This was the Tang dynasty. And the Tang dynasty's answer to the question, built to do what exactly, was perhaps the most revolutionary of all. Their answer was, to not build it. To understand the Tang strategy, you must understand who they were, like the Sui rulers before them. The Li family, who founded the Tang, was a product of the mixed culture aristocracy of the north. They were part Han, part Xianbei. They were fluent in Turkic languages. They were brilliant horsemen. They had grown up fighting alongside and against the nomads. They did not just fear the steppe, they understood it. The architect of the Tang grand strategy was Li Shimin, known as Emperor Taizong. He is perhaps the most brilliant military and political leader in China's history. When Taizong looked at the northern frontier, he did not see a line to be defended with earth and stone. He saw a dynamic problem to be solved with a superior idea. Taizong rejected the wall strategy as a failure. He saw it as a sign of weakness, a passive defense, an expensive and ultimately useless prison that trapped the empire in, while never truly keeping the enemy out. His grand strategy was the opposite of the wall. It was not defensive isolation, it was offensive expansion, diplomatic assimilation, and cultural confidence. First, Taizong used his military, a new hybrid force of Chinese infantry and allied Turkic cavalry, to do what the Han had only dreamed of. He didn't just push the Gokturks back, he shattered their khaganate. He sent his armies deep into the steppe, deep into Central Asia, breaking the power of his nomadic rivals. But then he did something politically masterful. He did not just declare himself a conqueror. Instead, in 630 CE, the defeated Turkic tribes, in a formal submission, declared him their heavenly Khagan, or Khan of Khans. This is the key Emperor Taizong now held two titles. To his subjects in the south, he was the Tianzi, the son of heaven, the traditional emperor of China. To the nomads of the north, he was the Tengri Khagan, the heavenly Khan, their supreme ruler. He was now the emperor of both the sedentary agricultural world and the nomadic steppe world. So, what is the purpose of a great wall? A wall is built to separate us from them. But what do you do when the emperor of us is also the emperor of them? The wall, in the Tang worldview, was obsolete. It was an insult. It was a relic of a failed binary way of thinking. Taizong's border was not a line of rammed earth. His border was the limit of his own power, which now extended far beyond the old walls, deep into the Gobi Desert and along the Silk Road. The Tang strategy was to control the steppe, not to hide from it. They co-opted the very barbarians the wall was meant to stop, hiring elite Turkic cavalry units to serve as the vanguard of the Tang army. The wolf was no longer at the door. He was now the emperor's royal guard. Under Tang rule, the Silk Road, which the Han Wall had been built to protect, was thrown wide open. The Tang Empire became the most cosmopolitan, open, and international power on Earth. Its capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, was the largest city in the world, a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. Its markets were filled with Persian nobles fleeing the Arab conquest, with Sogdian merchants from Samarkand, with Arab traders, Jewish bankers, and Nestorian Christian priests. This was an empire built on confidence, not fear. It was an empire of inclusion, not isolation. And so, for 300 years, during China's most powerful and brilliant dynasty, the Great Wall was utterly abandoned. The Qin and Han ramparts, now nearly 1,000 years old, were left to the wind and the rain. They were a historical curiosity. Poets would ride past them and write sad poems about the suffering of the Qin laborers, contrasting it with the glory of the Tang. The wall was a memory. The Tang Great Wall was not a physical structure. It was a wall of cavalry, a wall of diplomacy, and a wall of immense cultural self-confidence. They believed, for a time, that they were simply better than a wall. This too would eventually collapse, but it stands as the great historical exception. It is the 300-year period where China, at its peak, decided that the best wall was no wall at all. The Southern Retreat, the Song Dynasty. The golden age of the Tang, that magnificent era of cosmopolitan confidence, was not to last. In 907 CE, the dynasty collapsed, and China once again fractured, but this was not a repeat of the 400-year period of disunion. A new, powerful, and wealthy dynasty rose from the south. The Song. The Song dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279 CE, was another of China's great golden ages, but it was a different kind of golden age. The Tang was an age of military expansion, aristocratic glamour, and international adventure. The Song was an age of commercial revolution, technological invention, and profound internal reflection. This was the era of the world's first paper money, the invention of the compass, the perfection of gunpowder, and some of the most beautiful and subtle landscape painting in human history. But this internal, sophisticated, and commercial renaissance came at a terrible military cost. The Song dynasty was, from its very inception, militarily weak. It had a crucial strategic vulnerability. It never controlled the north. During the chaos after the Tang collapse, a new nomadic power, the Khitans, had swept down from Manchuria. They established their own powerful, Sinicized dynasty, the Liao dynasty, and they controlled a critical piece of territory that the Song desperately needed: the 16 prefectures. This was a region just south of the old Qin-Han walls, a territory that included the land around modern-day Beijing. This was the strategic gateway to the North China Plain. Without it, the Song dynasty had no natural buffer. They had no mountains to defend. They were exposed, their capital at Kaifeng lying on a flat, open plain, vulnerable to any cavalry army from the north. So, what happened to the Great Wall? The Great Wall was now in enemy territory. The ancient rammed earth lines of the Qin and Han were deep inside the Liao kingdom. The very idea of building a new wall on the border was a geographical and political impossibility. The Song had no defensible border to build a wall on. Their solution to the northern question was a complete departure from anything that had come before. It was a strategy of humiliation, desperation, and brilliant, bizarre innovation. First, like the early Han, they tried the Heikin policy. They paid the Liao dynasty a massive annual tribute of silver and silk to, quite simply, not invade. This was an open admission that the barbarian was now the military superior. Second, they implemented a defensive strategy that was not a wall of earth, but a wall of trees. This was the Green Great Wall. Recognizing that the primary advantage of the nomadic invaders was their cavalry, the Song court, in a desperate project, began planting millions of trees, elm and willow, in a vast, wide belt along their northern frontier. The goal was to create a man-made forest so dense that it would impede the movement of horses, bog down the cavalry in a way that earthworks could not, and give Song infantry a fighting chance. It was a fascinating and ultimately futile attempt at ecological warfare. Their real Great Wall was not on the northern plains. It was liquid. It was the Grand Canal, which they used to ship the vast grain resources of the south to their northern armies. And later, it was the Yangtze River, behind which they would retreat. This strategy failed. In 1125, a new, even more powerful barbarian group, the Jurchens, swept down, annihilated the Liao dynasty, and then just kept going. They crossed the Song's pathetic forest wall, and in 1127, they captured the Song capital of Kaifeng. It was a humiliation that would scar the Chinese psyche forever. The Jurchens, who established their own Jin dynasty, had conquered all of northern China. The Song court fled, becoming the Southern Song, their new capital at Hangzhou, a wealthy port city on the coast. And now, the final irony. The Jin dynasty, the barbarian conquerors, found themselves ruling northern China. And who was to their north? A new, rising threat, a confederation of nomadic tribes, united under a charismatic, brutal, and brilliant leader. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. And what did the Jin dynasty do? In a desperate panic, they became the greatest wall builders since the Qin. The Jin dynasty, between 1123 and 1224, conscripted millions of laborers and built a massive, complex system of walls and trenches. This was not a single line. It was a deep, multi-layered defense. But it was built of rammed earth, and it was facing the wrong enemy. Genghis Khan's Mongol army was not a collection of raiders. It was the most sophisticated, disciplined, and terrifying military machine the world had ever seen. They were masters of siege warfare, intelligence, and psychological terror. In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin. Their Great Wall, he said, was no more than a shadow. He didn't bother going around it. He found a section, concentrated his forces, and, using his superior siegecraft, simply punched through it. The wall that had been built at such human cost, the last great rammed earth wall of the medieval age, collapsed in a matter of days. The Song strategy of avoidance had failed. The Jin strategy of copying the ancient Qin wall had failed even more spectacularly. The board was now set for the ultimate failure of the Great Wall concept. The Mongols were coming, and they would not just cross the wall, they would conquer everything. The Mongol Interlude, the Yuan dynasty. Genghis Khan's breach of the Jin dynasty's wall was not just a military victory, it was a conceptual one. It was the definitive, bloody, and final proof that the ancient strategy of a static, linear defense was utterly, hopelessly obsolete against a new kind of total, mobile warfare. The Mongols did not just defeat the Jin. They and their descendants would go on to conquer everything. Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan, would complete the conquest. He did what no barbarian had ever dreamed of doing. He didn't just conquer northern China, as the Jin had done. He swept south, destroyed the last remnants of the Song dynasty, and in 1279, he declared himself the emperor of all China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. The barbarian was no longer at the gate. He was on the throne. This event is the single most profound break in the 2,000-year history of the Wall, the Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368, was a Mongol dynasty. The ruling elite, the entire power structure of China, was now composed of the very people the Wall had been built to stop. So, for the third time in our story, we must ask the question, what is the purpose of the Great Wall? Under the Yuan dynasty, the answer was clearer than ever. It had no purpose. It was not just obsolete, it was a joke. It was a monument to the spectacular failure of the dynasties that had come before. Kublai Khan's empire was not China. He was the great Khan of a global empire that stretched from the shores of Korea to the plains of Hungary. His capital was not just the Chinese capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing. It was the center of a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol-enforced peace that reopened the Silk Road and connected all of Eurasia. In this new, globalized world, the Great Wall was a meaningless, crumbling line in the middle of his own territory. His empire was on both sides of it. Why would a Mongol Khan, whose power was built on the free movement of cavalry, trade, and information across the steppe, maintain a wall that was designed to stop that very thing? And so, for nearly a century, the wall was left to die its final death. The ancient rammed earth ramparts of the Qin, Han, and Jin, now over 1,000 years old in places, were truly abandoned. No soldiers manned their towers. No laborers were conscripted for their repair. The wall was, for the first and only time in its history, completely and totally irrelevant. Kublai Khan's defense was not a wall. It was a postal system. The Yuan dynasty's true innovation was the Yam, the Mongol Pony Express. This was a vast, continent-spanning network of postal stations, guard posts, and supply depots, which allowed the Khan's messengers and armies to move with astonishing speed. This was the Internet of the 13th century. It was a system of connection, not division. In fact, the Yuan dynasty actively destroyed fortifications. They dismantled city walls and strategic passes, the very things that could be used by local warlords or rebels to resist their rule. A wall, to the Mongols, was a prison. It was a tool of the weak, sedentary farmer, not the strong, mobile warrior. It was during this time that the first Europeans, most famously the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, traveled to China. Polo, who lived and worked in Kublai Khan's court for 17 years and traveled extensively, wrote one of the most detailed accounts of 13th century China, and in his entire voluminous book, The Travels of Marco Polo, he never mentions the Great Wall. This silence has puzzled historians for centuries. Some have used it to claim he never went to China at all, but the real answer is far simpler. Why would he mention it? What was there to see? By 1280, the Great Wall was not a magnificent stone dragon. It was a 1,500-year-old, slumped, eroded, discontinuous, and utterly abandoned line of mud. It was a low, grass-covered mound, a minor feature in the landscape. It was a ruin, far less impressive than the Grand Canal, the bustling cities, or the imperial palaces he described. He didn't mention it, because it wasn't worth mentioning. This was the true Dark Age for the wall. It had failed as a military barrier against the Jin. It had failed as a conceptual barrier against the Mongols. It had been proven, definitively, to be a failed idea. This should have been the end of the story. The Great Wall of China should have gone the way of Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a fascinating archaeological relic, a tourist curiosity, but a dead piece of history. But it was not the end, because the Mongol dynasty, like all dynasties, eventually grew weak, and the native Han Chinese, who had lived under barbarian rule for a century, were biding their time. A new, powerful, and fiercely xenophobic native dynasty would rise, and they would look at the northern frontier, not with the cosmopolitan confidence of the Tang or the global perspective of the Mongols, but with a new and powerful paranoia, and they would build a new wall. And this wall, the one they built, the last Great Wall, is the only one you actually know. The wall you know, the Ming dynasty. The Mongol Yuan dynasty, which had seemed so invincible, collapsed with stunning speed. It was a victim of its own success. The Pax Mongolica that had connected the world also transmitted the world's diseases. The Black Death. This, combined with natural disasters, inflation, and growing resentment from the native Han population, sparked a massive nationwide rebellion. In 1368, a former peasant and Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang led a successful revolt, captured the capital Dadu, and forced the last Mongol emperor to flee back to the steppe. He declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Ming, or Bright. The Ming dynasty was a pivotal, powerful, and deeply complex era, and it was founded on one core, defining idea. Never again. Never again would China be ruled by a barbarian from the north. The entire identity of the Ming dynasty was a reaction against the Mongols. It was a project of cultural and ethnic purification. The Ming emperors sought to erase the Yuan dynasty, to purge China of all Mongol influence, and to restore what they saw as the pure, ancient Han Chinese culture of the past. This was an age of restoration, but also an age of profound paranoia. The Mongols they had expelled were not destroyed. They were right there. They had simply retreated back to the steppe, to their homeland in Mongolia. They were still a powerful, mobile, cavalry-based threat, and they were angry. They saw the Ming emperor as a usurper, and they spent the next 2 centuries launching raids, trying to reconquer the empire they believed was theirs. The Ming dynasty was born with a Mongol problem that it could never solve. The first Ming emperors, like the founder Zhu Yuanzhang, the Hongwu emperor, and his brilliant son, Zhu Di, the Yongle emperor, were aggressive. They followed the Tang dynasty's strategy, offensive warfare. Emperor Yongle, the same man who built the Forbidden City in Beijing and sent the treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He across the ocean, personally led 5 massive campaigns into the steppe, trying to find and destroy the Mongol court. He was a man of supreme confidence. His strategy was offensive, not defensive. He was not a wall builder. But this strategy died with him. The offensive campaigns were colossally expensive and, ultimately, indecisive. You cannot conquer the steppe. You cannot occupy the Gobi. The Mongols would simply melt away from the massive Ming armies, wait for them to run out of supplies, and then return. In 1449, this entire strategy collapsed in a single catastrophic event known as the Tumu Crisis. The young foolish emperor Zhengtong was convinced by his eunuch advisors to personally lead a massive army into the steppe to punish the Mongol leader, Esen Taishi. The expedition was a logistical nightmare. It was a disaster. Esen Taishi's small mobile cavalry force ambushed the massive lumbering Ming army, annihilated it, and captured the emperor. The emperor of China was now a prisoner of the Mongols. This was a humiliation on a scale that shattered the dynasty's self-confidence. The capital, Beijing, was besieged. The Ming dynasty almost collapsed. When the emperor was eventually ransomed and returned, the political calculus in the Ming court changed forever. The offensive faction, the generals who wanted to be like the Tang, was discredited. A new defensive faction rose to power. Their argument was simple. We cannot beat them, we tried, and we lost our emperor. We must never go out there again. We must lock the door. This is the moment the Great Wall that you see in pictures was born. The Ming Dynasty, from the mid-15th century onward, embarked on the single most expensive, obsessive, and massive construction project in the history of the world. It was a 150-year-long act of national paranoid obsession. They did not repair the old, 1,500-year-old rammed earth walls of the Qin and Han. They were useless, in the wrong places, and built of the wrong material. The Ming built a new wall, a better wall. This new wall was not made of mud. It was built on a foundation of massive stone slabs quarried from the mountains. Its core was rammed earth, but its face, its skin, was made of kiln-fired bricks and stone, held together with a revolutionary new mortar made of sticky rice and slaked lime, which was stronger than cement. This was not a low rampart. This was a 40-foot-high, 20-foot-wide fortress. It was a continuous paved road on top, wide enough for 5 horsemen to ride abreast. It was a weapon. It was studded with thousands of densely packed, multi-story watchtowers, fortresses, and barracks. It was designed to kill. Its towers were not just for signals. They were artillery platforms, designed with arrow loops and cannon ports for the new gunpowder weapons of the era. This was a 16th century, state-of-the-art military fortification, the pre-modern equivalent of building a 3,000-kilometer-long battleship. And its purpose was not trade. It was not communication. It was not a highway. Its purpose was to be a line, an absolute, final, and non-negotiable line. The Ming Dynasty, in its paranoia, was attempting to create a permanent solution to the Mongol problem. It was a declaration in stone and brick. We are sedentary. They are nomadic. We are pure. They are barbarian. And this is the line that will separate us forever. It was the ultimate expression of an isolationist, fortress mentality. It was an attempt to legislate reality, to force the world into the two, simple categories the Ming court so desperately wanted to believe in. This was a wall built by fear. The wall as a system, what it really did. So what was this final Ming Dynasty wall really built to do? The simple answer is stop the Mongols. But the real answer, the cultural echoes answer, is far more complex. The wall itself was just the visible tip of a massive, multi-layered, and colossally expensive system. The Ming wall was, first and foremost, a system of denial. Its primary function was to deny the steppe nomads their primary military advantage, mobility. A Mongol raid was a blitzkrieg. It was built on the speed of a horse. A raiding party could cross the border, an invisible line in the grass, ride 100 kilometers south, sack a village, and be back in the steppe with their plunder, grain, livestock, and people, before a Ming army could even be mobilized. The wall was a speed bump. It was a physical barrier that forced the raiders to stop. They could not ride their horses over a 40-foot brick wall. They had to dismount. They had to become infantry. And the moment a Mongol warrior was off his horse, he was no longer a Superman. He was just a man. The second a raiding party was forced to stop and invest a watchtower or a section of the wall, they lost the one thing they couldn't afford to lose: time. This is where the second part of the system kicked in: communication. The Ming Wall was the most sophisticated signaling system of the pre-modern world. The thousands of watchtowers were in line of sight with each other. A fire lit with wolf dung, which produced a straight, black, oily smoke, or a gunpowder and sulfur fire for a bright flame at night, would be lit at the first point of contact. That signal would be seen by the next tower, which would light its fire, and the next, and the next. That signal, attack at Tower 7, would race down the line, traveling hundreds of kilometers in a matter of hours, far faster than any horse. It would alert the regional headquarters, a massive fortress behind the lines, that a breach was happening. This brings in the third part of the system: force projection. The wall was not an unmanned fence, it was a garrison. At its peak, the Ming Dynasty had, according to some estimates, nearly 1 million men stationed on the northern frontier to man this wall. These were not conscripts, like the Qin. This was a permanent, professional, hereditary army. When the signal of a breach arrived, the local general didn't have to ride out into the open steppe to find the enemy. He knew exactly where they were. They were pinned at Tower 7. He could then dispatch a cavalry force from his fortress, riding along the top of the wall, a safe, paved, elevated highway, and descend on the raiders from a position of strength, trapping them between the wall and his army. The wall, in this sense, was a force multiplier. It allowed a smaller defensive force to respond effectively to a larger, mobile raiding force. But there was a fourth, and perhaps more crucial purpose: economics and trade. The Ming court was, in theory, deeply isolationist. They had banned private sea trade, and they officially banned trade with the Mongols. But this was the source of the entire problem. The Mongols were not just raiders, they were traders. They needed the products of the south. They needed grain, silk, tea, and, most of all, iron for their weapons. And the Chinese needed the products of the steppe: horses. The Ming court's refusal to trade, their fortress mentality, was what caused the raids. A Mongol leader, denied the iron he needed at a trading post, would simply take it by force from a border village. The raids were, in many cases, just shopping by other means. So the wall became a filter. It was a way to stop unauthorized trade, raiding, and force all trade through a few, heavily fortified and government-controlled gates. At these gates, like the famous Jiayuguan in the west or Shanhaiguan in the east, the barbarians would be allowed to come, in small, unarmed groups, to trade. The wall, in this sense, was a tool of economic coercion. It was an attempt to control the market. By holding a monopoly on the goods the Mongols needed, the Ming court could play the Mongol tribes off against each other. They could reward good tribes who submitted with trade rights and punish bad tribes who were defiant with an embargo. So the Ming Wall was a brilliant, complex, and layered system. It was a military tripwire, a high-speed communication network, a force projection highway, and a tool of economic strangulation. It was also a colossal, soul-crushing failure. It was, simply put, the most expensive and least effective project ever undertaken. The cost of building it and manning it with 1 million men was a black hole that swallowed the entire Ming budget. The silver that should have gone to building a navy, to paying internal administrators, to fighting pirates on the coast, all of it was shoveled into this one, paranoid northern project. And it didn't even work. It failed because a wall is only as strong as the men who guard it. The soldiers on the frontier were hereditary, which meant they were a low-status, underpaid, and unmotivated caste. They were miserable. They were stationed in the most desolate, cold, and boring places in the empire. Their pay was always in arrears. To survive, what did they do? They traded. They would illegally trade with the very barbarians they were supposed to be stopping, tossing them bags of grain or iron tools over the side of the wall in exchange for furs or livestock. And if a Mongol leader offered a general a large enough bribe, that general would simply open the gate. The wall was breached, time and time again, not by cannon, but by corruption. In 1550, the Mongol leader Altan Khan, frustrated by the lack of trade, simply rode around the unfinished wall and besieged Beijing again. The Ming Dynasty had bankrupted itself to build a 3,000-kilometer-long door, and then failed to properly pay the guards who held the keys. 30. The end of the wall. The Qing Dynasty. The end of the Great Wall, as a serious idea, came not with a bang, but with a whisper that turned a lock. By 1644, the Ming Dynasty was rotting from the inside. It was bankrupt. The silver from the New World that had fueled its economy had dried up. The government was paralyzed by factions of eunuchs and Confucian scholars, and the people were in open, massive rebellion. A rebel leader named Li Zicheng, a peasant, had declared his own dynasty and was marching on Beijing. The Ming were collapsing. But to their north, in Manchuria, a new, powerful, and highly organized force had risen. They were a Jurchen people, like the ones who had founded the Jin dynasty, but they had renamed themselves. They were the Manchus. The Manchus were a hybrid power. They were brilliant horse archers, like the Mongols, but they had also adopted Chinese systems of government, gunpowder weapons, and bureaucracy. They were a sophisticated military state, and they were watching the Ming Empire tear itself apart, waiting for their moment. In April 1644, that moment came. The rebel leader Li Zicheng entered Beijing. The last Ming emperor, the Chongzhen emperor, in a final act of despair, hanged himself on a tree behind the Forbidden City. The Ming dynasty was over. But the Ming army was not. The single most powerful, elite Ming army, the one that had been garrisoning the Great Wall, was still intact. It was commanded by a general named Wu Sangui, and he was stationed at the single most important pass in all of China, Shanhaiquan, the pass where the mountains meet the sea. This fortress was the end of the Great Wall, where the stone dragon met the Pacific Ocean. It was the linchpin of the entire defensive system, and Wu Sangui held the keys. Wu Sangui was now in an impossible position. The emperor he had sworn to serve was dead. The capital was held by a peasant rebel he despised. And outside the wall, just a few kilometers away, was the entire Manchu army, led by their brilliant regent, Dorgon, waiting to see what he would do. Wu Sangui had 3 choices. 1. Surrender to the rebels. 2. Fight the Manchus. 3. Make a deal. He chose number 3. In a decision that would define the next 300 years of Chinese history, Wu Sangui made a fateful bargain. He wrote to Dorgon, the Manchu leader, and offered to join him. He would open the gate if Dorgon would help him destroy the peasant rebels and, supposedly, restore the Ming. Dorgon agreed. On the night of June 6, 1644, Wu Sangui, the general of the Great Wall, opened the main gate at Shanhaiquan. He let the barbarians in. The Manchu army, a disciplined and powerful force, poured through the gate. They did not restore the Ming. They marched on Beijing, crushed the peasant rebellion, and declared their own dynasty. This was the Qing dynasty. This is the ultimate and most profound failure of the Great Wall. The most expensive and complex defensive fortification in human history was not breached. It was not destroyed by cannon. It was not climbed by ladders. It was opened from the inside by a Ming general. And with that, the Great Wall's purpose, its 2,000-year-long story, ended. The Qing dynasty, like the Yuan dynasty before it, was a conquest dynasty. The Manchus were the rulers of China. Their empire was vast. It included not just China proper, but also Mongolia, Tibet, and their homeland of Manchuria. Once again, the Great Wall was a useless line in the middle of their own massive empire. Their empire was on both sides of it, and so for the final time, the wall was abandoned, But this time, it was abandoned forever. The Qing emperors, confident in their power, had no use for it. They saw it as a symbol of Ming paranoia and Ming failure. They let it fall into ruin, and so it sat for 300 years. The stones were poached by farmers to build houses. The wind and the rain eroded the mortar. It became the long, silent, crumbling spine of a dead dragon. It was not until the 20th century, when the last dynasty had fallen, that the wall was reborn. It was reborn not as a military tool, but as a symbol for the new, modern Chinese Republic, and later for the communist state. The wall was reimagined. It was no longer a symbol of Ming failure and isolation. It became a symbol of Chinese endurance, a symbol of the masses, of the labor of millions. It became a nationalist icon, a tourist destination, and the logo of China itself. So, what was the Great Wall built to do? It was built to do everything. It was built to be a border, a highway, a customs office, a tripwire, an isolationist prison, and a cultural statement. It was, in the end, a mirror, reflecting the changing anxieties and ambitions of China itself. And in that, it was, perhaps, the most successful failure in human history. And so, the wall we see today, the magnificent stone dragon on the mountaintops, is not the Great Wall. It is just the final, glorious, and failed chapter of a 2,000-year-long story. It is a story of rammed earth, of willow branches, of stone, and of brick. A story of walls built against other Chinese, walls built by barbarians, and walls that were abandoned for centuries. The wall was not a simple fence. It was a complex living system. It was a response to an unsolvable problem. How does a sedentary agricultural empire defend itself from a mobile nomadic one? In the end, it couldn't. Its greatest failure was that it was a static solution to a fluid problem. It was a line drawn in stone, in a world that refused to honor it. And yet, its true purpose, its cultural echo, was not found in its military success, but in its existence. It was a jobs program for millions. It was a political statement. And today, it is the ultimate symbol of a nation's persistence. It was built to do everything. And in the end, its greatest function is simply to be. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive at Cultural Echoes. If you believe these complex, quiet stories of our past are worth telling, I invite you to join our community, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the wisdom of the ages. And now, I turn the echo to you. After hearing its long history, what do you believe was the real purpose of the Great Wall? Was it a brilliant military system or a colossal, paranoid failure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening. And until next time, be well.